ready.
Okay, perfect. So, hello everyone. My name is Chantal, and this is my colleague Lea, and we are the Green Patrol team at Éco-Quartier NDG for the summer. Today we are going to be presenting a webinar called The Importance of Biodiversity. So if you are interested in biodiversity, how we could improve it, then keep on watching. Perfect. So our presentation plan for today is going to start off with what exactly is biodiversity and why it is important. We're going to explore the concepts of ecosystem services, our connection with nature, and our implications for well-being. Then we're going to dive into the impact of cities on biodiversity, an example of biodiversity in Montreal, and what you can do to help biodiversity. And then we're going to end with a question and discussion period. So just a little disclaimer, Lea and I are not experts, nor do we claim to be. We're just telling you guys what we know and a little bit of what we researched.
So what is biodiversity? So we tend to think of biodiversity as different types of animals and plants that we find in an ecosystem, but actually biodiversity is a diversity of life at all levels. So that includes genes, species, ecosystems. So, even the genes within one person, within a whole population of people, of animals, of mammals, right down to ecosystem diversity, which means, different types of ecosystems such as boreal forests, tundra, deserts, etc. So it's a very broad term, but we'll be talking a little bit about biodiversity in general and a little bit more about urban biodiversity.
So why is biodiversity important? Well, in order to understand this, we actually need to explore what ecosystem services are. So ecosystem services are essentially services that the environment provides us directly or indirectly. So we have 4 different types of ecosystem services: regulating, which consists of air quality, climate, water, runoff, erosion, natural hazards, and pollination; supporting, consisting of nutrient cycling, water cycling, soil formation, and photosynthesis; provisioning, including food, fiber, biomass, fuel, fresh water, and natural medicines; and finally we have cultural, consisting of ethical values, existence values, recreation, and ecotourism. So you may be wondering, where does biodiversity actually fit into all of this? Next slide, Leah. Perfect. So biodiversity actually provides us food security, climate security, water security, energy security, and health. However, it is being impacted by climate change and land use change, which has huge risks for many countries, including agricultural productivity loss and loss of vegetative cover. However, biodiversity, in combination with different laws and policies and conscious consumption, we can actually create new opportunities to increase economic development and global environmental leadership. So biodiversity in turn is actually crucial. So what I'm going to do is explore different types of ecosystem services and how they relate to biodiversity with a few key examples. So first we have regulating. So we can kind of see biodiversity as being a natural filter in order to create clean air. So being in the city, there usually is more pollution. So it is good to have a variety of plants that take in the pollutants in order to create good air for us to breathe. They also create cooler spaces. So simply being in a green space could actually make the environment cooler by 10 degrees Celsius, which is crazy. However, it is also important that we have cooler spaces with canopy cover from different species. So we can have trees in the shade, so it's more comfortable living in an urban environment. This has also implications for climate change. So as climate change continues to increase, we are more likely to see more extreme events. So heat events such as heat waves. So this is a concern when it comes to more vulnerable communities that don't necessarily have access to an air conditioner and or family to help them survive the heat event. So creating these cooler spaces can be essential to their survival. And finally, the more biodiversity, the more resilience. So this may be a bit abstract, but let's say you have a city with only one type of tree species. And all of a sudden, there's a huge climatic event or increase in temperature, and all of a sudden, the climatic conditions are no longer adequate for the survival of that species. So that species dies off, and before you know it, you have no more plants in your city. This is why it's important to plant a variety of plants and trees in order to be more resilient, because if you plant 10 species and only one dies off, you still have all those ecosystem services that are offered by the remaining 9 trees. Next slide.
Sorry, I'm just trying to.
No problem.
All right.
So yeah, next we have supporting ecosystem services. So an example that I drew out was from Éco-Quartier, where they praised the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash. So these 3 plants are actually very much praised in their culture for being very productive together. So they are praised with ceremonies and rituals during the planting season. So these are known as companion plants. So it allows for successful companion planting. So corn rather, provides the support for the beans to grow on. Then you have beans that actually undergo nitrification. So it takes in nitrogen from the air that's needed for all 3 plants to survive. Also, the beans eventually grow up onto the corn, but from the support it provides. Then finally, we have squash, which actually has huge leaves and allows to create some shade for all 3 plant species to cool, but also it defends it against natural predators and pests. So altogether, this creates a sustainable polyculture, which allows the soils to be fertile and provide us with good food. So in terms of polycultures versus monocultures, it is important that we actually create polycultures to allow these companion plants to thrive together, and they provide each other with different needs. So whereas if you had monoculture with just corn, you would need to add so many more resources in order to be successful than compared to a polyculture such as the 3 Sisters garden. Next. Back one slide.
You see it?
You have to go back one more slide. You skipped.
Oh, I have to go back?
Yeah, one more.
Oh, look at that.
So next we have provisioning ecosystem services. So being in the West Island, we tend to have more agricultural land such as Mac Campus, but in general, when you're out in rural areas, you can see fields of agricultural land. So often on these lands, they use fertilizers and pesticides. And eventually with rain, these could run off the land. So in turn, what happens, it goes towards our water environments and actually causes blue-green algae to form and create dead zones. So the common example of this situation, a dead zone, can be found in the Gulf of Mexico near the Mississippi River. So there's a lot of agricultural runoff in the area where a bunch of nutrients are run off into the water. And what happens is that they actually create blue-green algae, which causes the environment to be oxygen deprived. And what's growing beneath the blue-green algae no longer has oxygen to survive. So it could be different plants, or it could be fish, for example. So this is what's known as eutrophication. So this can actually happen in our freshwater environments in the St. Lawrence River or the Lake of Two Mountains, for example. However, this also has implications for our health because we get we have water that we use to drink, but also for recreation. And this could cause risk to human health. So it could cause potentially methemoglobinemia, which is essentially oxygen deprivation in your blood if it is ingested. So in order to prevent this, we need to use plants and different types of plants as a natural filter, as I previously mentioned. So these could be grown alongside a body of water in order to absorb all the nutrients that is coming from the runoff. So the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the sulfur. for example. So if we have this, it could be absorbed into the plants, and then this prevents the issue of eutrophication from occurring in our freshwater habitats. And finally, we have cultural ecosystem services, which really is connected to our connection with nature. So being a science student, I've been exposed to many, I guess, Western scientific classes, I guess you can say. One example I like to use is I took this class on population and community ecology, and I was like, oh, great, I'm going to learn so much. I'm going to learn about maybe a bit more about their history and their traditional uses or something like that. No, I was actually faced with a very mathematical-based class, which had obscure numbers to calculate the relationships between different species, when these numbers didn't really make sense. I'm like, okay, so the higher the number, the more connected they are, but it doesn't really give you a sense of the relationship between species A and species B. So with urban growth, we tend to shut out what is known as traditional ecological knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge is essentially the knowledge accumulated by indigenous peoples over hundreds and thousands of years through their connection to the land. So yes, Western science has a bunch of database calculations and stuff like that, but traditional ecological knowledge really refers to land and what it is. So we really need to rethink of how we're thinking, how we think of the land in terms of Western science versus traditional ecological knowledge. Next, there's the whole ecocentric versus anthropocentric ordeal. So anthropocentric views allow us to see nature as a means to an end. It allows us to see it as a place to extract resources for economic gain, whereas ecocentric really sees the plant as it is, as having intrinsic value. So if we can shift our way of thinking to being one of more ecocentric, then we can actually increase our connection with nature rather than seeing biodiversity in different plants as something for economic gain. Then there's the whole he, she versus it. So I read this book called Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer last semester, and it was really insightful because she really talks about how naming our plants really allows us to be more connected to them. So I'm going to give you a visual example because I had to. Here is my plant Stella. So I feed Stella, I take care of her, I talk to her, and really just simply naming the plant allows me to be more connected to it. Whereas if I just call a plant it, then I tend to be less connected to it, less inclined to take care of it. So it's like, for example, like in nature, we need to be a bit more connected to our environment in a way, because indigenous people see the land as a living, breathing organism with different living, breathing parts. So we need to really think about how we connect to nature, and this is one way that we can actually increase our connection with it. Next, indigenous peoples really see the land as a gift, and they think about our relationship with Mother Nature being one that's reciprocal. So let's say we take good care of the land, then well, Mother Nature is going to give us the gift of fresh water, clean air in return. However, if we don't take care of it, if we continue to deforest and cause pollution, well, then she's going to give us back not so clean air and not so clean water, for example. So what does this have to do with biodiversity? Well, yes, we need to increase biodiversity to our cities, but also we need to change our way of thinking, because we tend to look at biodiversity being numbers and indices and stuff like that, but we really need to start thinking about it in a more traditional way and seeing how biodiversity really thrives in the natural environment rather than seeing it as a number between 0 and 1, for example. Next. Little quick section on well-being. Overall, green spaces improve our mental health, so they could reduce hypertension, anxiety, depression, stuff like that, but also in an indirect way, they impact our well-being, because usually you're more inclined to go be physically active in a space where there's a bunch of trees where you could run rather than an unsafe street with loud cars all around you. So if you have more green spaces with biodiversity, then you're more likely to go outside and run, for example, and then in turn impacts and improves your mental health. So yeah, what about the biodiversity? There have been studies on it saying that biodiversity actually improves our well-being and mental health, because when you're walking down the street and you have all the same trees on the side versus when you have a street with different textures, colors, heights, different types of species, you tend to be better off. That's what I read about, at least. Also, in terms of well-being, our well-being is increased due to the ecosystem services that I previously talked about. Next slide. So now we need to really talk about the elephant in the room, I guess you could say, the impact of cities on biodiversity. So here you can see that Manhattan was once a luscious green forest, but we also need to think about biodiversity as in terms of the future of our children. Say at this rate that our children won't really face, or grandchildren won't really face, a world that has such luscious biodiversity. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about a few concepts concerning cities. So I'm going to dive into urbanization and very much related concept, urban sprawl, and then talk a bit more about a global problem known, I hope you've heard of it, climate change. So over half the world's population is considered to be urban, which does have many advantages, because living in an urban environment actually allows you to use less resources because you're living on a smaller plot of land, maybe in an apartment building, for example. Also, since it is more dense, you're more likely to be close to your much needed resources, so like your food and maybe even your friends. Also, in terms of transportation, you don't necessarily need to use your car. Since it's so close, you could walk or bike if the infrastructure is present, so sidewalks and bike paths. However, the issue of space comes into, I guess we need to really talk about space, because our population is increasing and we need to make space for that increasing population. So we've really been facing the loss of urban biodiversity with plants and different animals. You can see in downtown Montreal, old fields, grass fields in the city center have been transformed into high-rise apartment buildings. Next slide. So very much related is the concept of urban sprawl. So urban sprawl is defined as the expansion of poorly planned, low density, auto-dependent development, also known as suburbia. So I live in the suburbs and I have my opinions concerning it, but I won't dive too deep into it because that's gonna get a little too personal. But I can say that increase in urban sprawl can allow for increases in pollution and deforestation. So first of all, pollution, because unlike the more urban environment, your resources are less accessible, because they're too far away, or maybe because there's not a bike path for you to go to the grocery store, for example, or a proper sidewalk to walk on. So you have no choice, or you're left with little choice to take your car to go get your groceries, for example, or to see your friends. There's always the STM, but the STM is not that convenient where I live, at least in West Island. Also, there's also the issue of deforestation. So as we become, I guess, there's more suburb area, there's more deforestation to increase the number of housing available. So if you see St. Anne's, there's a bunch of new houses being built on huge plots of land. There's huge houses using a ton of resources for only 2 people living in a house that have 4 cars. So essentially, urban sprawl dissolves the benefits of biodiversity. So as I already mentioned, this whole natural filter thing. So if you live near a busy road or highway, having an area of biodiverse forest is great, because it can act as, it can absorb the pollution coming from the highway or the busy road. As well, it could act as a sound barrier, so you don't hear the highway as much. However, if it's not there, you do not have that natural filter. Same thing when it comes to being a carbon sink. So you no longer have those plants available to absorb the carbon pollution coming from a road that's adjacent to the forested area, for example. Also, biodiversity, just because the benefits of biodiversity are dissolved, including the symbiotic relationships between certain species. So here I just put a couple of examples to show you guys. Next slide. So I guess a very common example, but squirrels and oak trees. You see squirrels everywhere trying to find nuts on trees. And the oak trees are actually a food source for these squirrels. Also, sometimes you might see a squirrel trying to bury its food into the ground. Well, they forget it sometimes and actually distribute the oak tree population. So this is an example that benefits both the squirrels and the oak trees, so a mutualistic relationship. Next slide. There's also the bees and the flowers. So the flowers provide nectar and pollen for bees to feed their colony, while bees spread pollen from flower to flower, allowing the population of this said flower to reproduce. But actually, this is very, very important. It's a crucial relationship because if bees disappear, we would only have 4 years left to live on our planet, which I find is insane. So this comes to show how crucial this relationship is in our environment. Okay. So finally, climate change. So urban environments are responsible for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is crazy. So this is mainly due to transportation. So as I previously discussed, being more in a suburban environment, you have to use more transportation, as well as from buildings, so building more buildings in the urban environment. Also, climate change causes restricted climatic envelopes. So a climatic envelope is essentially what a species needs to survive. So let's say species A has a certain conditions it needs. It needs a certain temperature range. It needs a certain rainfall range. It needs to have a certain soil conditions in order for it to survive. So I'd like to give the example of a mountain. So let's say you're a species at the base of a mountain and all of a sudden it gets a little too warm. So, okay, you're gonna move up the mountain a little bit. And then all of a sudden, a few years later, it gets a little warmer. So you have to keep on moving up the mountain. And you move up, you move up, you move up until you reach the top of the mountain. And what happens if it gets too warm? Well, the species is extinct from the area. It's no longer there. So there's also the example of where you could be halfway up the mountain, but then the soil conditions are not adequate for your survival. So same thing happens. And the fact about climate change is that species are given very little time to adapt genetically, because if it was a longer process, they would be able to adapt. However, since the rate of climate change is so rapid, they are unable to adapt. So they try to move, but eventually there's only so much they can do. So climate change also, as I said, ruins the symbiotic relationships and actually decreases biodiversity. So let's say we no longer have the squirrels. Well, how are the oaks gonna distribute their population? So you're not only losing one species, you're actually losing two, which is quite unfortunate. Next slide.
So here's an example of what not to do when planning for biodiversity. So I picked an example from our own city of Montreal related to urban trees. A lot of you may have heard about the emerald ash borer. So this is the greatest invasive species problem Montreal has ever faced. You'll probably never see an emerald ash borer. So it's this tiny green insect. It's smaller than a penny, and it's usually found on the top of ash trees. But it is a huge problem, believe me. So one of the reasons it's such a big problem is we have so many ash trees in Montreal. So we have about 48,000 street ash trees. So a fifth of all street trees in Montreal are actually ash trees. There's about 150,000 in urban parks and about 50,000 on private property. And there's also an undetermined amount in nature parks. So the reason we have so many ash trees is that when they were all, most of them were planted around the same time. So when Montreal planted a whole bunch of trees, they mostly planted the same few species, including the ash tree. And the reason they picked this tree is that it survives really well in urban environments because it survives well in soils that are poor and quite dry. So this makes it a big advantage. However, as Chantal mentioned, a lack of biodiversity makes an ecosystem very vulnerable to stress factors. So in this case, the stress factor is an invasive species, the ash borer. The ash borer is native to Asia. It's unknown how it was brought to Canada, but it's also a problem in many other cities because again, a lot of cities have planted many ash trees because it's such a great tree to plant in the city normally. But for now, we'll focus on its effect in Montreal. So unfortunately, Montreal can't go back and redo their plantation methods. Nowadays, the city plants a large variety of trees to avoid having another problem similar to that of the ash tree problem. So, however, we can't just cut down all the ash trees that are currently in Montreal. That would be a huge task, and we would have a very sudden loss of many mature trees. Even the new trees that are planted right now will take many years to have the same benefits as full-grown trees. So we want to prolong the life of our ash trees as long as possible. So right now, Montreal's ash trees are treated against the ash tree borer every 2 years. So this is a pesticide treatment. It is basically a biopesticide, even though it isn't officially certified as such, but it has all the characteristics of a biopesticide. So it's not 100% effective in the sense that there will still be ash tree borers on a tree that's been treated, but it really helps control the population. So the treatment is now free on trees on private property. You have to contact the city beforehand to get it treated, and you just have to do that every 2 years, but it's entirely free. However, some trees are beyond saving and they must be cut down. So there are also subsidies for the felling of trees on private property. So the city considers a tree should be cut down if 30% of its branches are dead. This is because after more than 30%, the treatment is no longer effective, and so that tree becomes a breeding ground for the emerald ash borer, and it can harm all the other surrounding trees. So once an ash tree is cut down, or if it falls down naturally, the city will replace it automatically. And that replacement is free, and they will of course select a different species than the ash tree for obvious reasons. So another really important component of managing the emerald ash tree borer is managing ash tree wood. And that's probably one of the main reasons the ash tree borer was allowed to spread in the first place. It's because the wood was not managed properly. So a lot of species can be spread through dead wood. Even in areas that aren't affected by the ash tree borer, there could be other invasive species, and it's really a better thing to buy your firewood locally than to drag it somewhere else, because wood is a big carrier of organisms. Even dead wood is still very much alive. So the city is also developing some alternative treatments for the ash tree borer. So two of the most promising ones that are being tested right now are a parasitic wasp, which is specifically attacks the ash tree borer and is native to the same region as this insect. And another one is an entomopathogenic fungus, which is also used to control other pests. But the city installs traps that use pheromones to specifically attract the ash tree borer to contaminate them with this fungus. So this fungus can also affect other insects, but these traps are meant to specifically target the ash tree borer. So it's a very promising method as well. And the hope is that once one insect is contaminated with the fungus, it can spread it to other insects of the same species. So there are many reasons why the city is so concerned with the ash tree problem, because trees have so many benefits in the city. So the classic thing that we think about is filtering the air. So trees filter the air of many fine particles from pollutants that are very present in the city, from cars, from all sorts of industries. And trees also help keep our city cool. So you might notice that under a tree, it's often a few degrees colder than just a few meters away. Trees also play a role in reducing many diseases, such as cardiac diseases, strokes, asthma, due to the fact that they filter the air. And of course, we have to mention that trees play a huge role in biodiversity. So we're not just talking about the diversity of trees, we're also talking about all the other species that are affected by trees. So that includes many insects, fungus, other plants, but also mammals such as birds and squirrels. So trees play a huge role in city biodiversity. They even help reduce obesity levels. As Chantal mentioned, trees tend to encourage people to exercise and spend time outdoors. They also help manage stormwater runoff. So trees absorb a lot of water. So that's very helpful as well in the city, especially during the summer when our sewer systems tend to be overloaded. They also increase the value of property because of, for example, all the benefits mentioned earlier. In fact, they have a role in reducing stress. So yeah, trees can help with anxiety and depression. So the city has a goal of increasing Montreal's canopy from 20 to 25%. 5% may not seem like much, but it's actually a lot of trees. It's, a quarter more trees than we currently have. So it's a big goal. So one of the ways to do this is a program called Éco-Quartier. So this program is meant to allow residents to plant trees in their own backyard. So it's a program that's subsidized. Normally trees would cost more than $100 depending on the species. But the city only sells them for, most trees they sell for this program are $25. They also have fruit trees for $35 and some big coniferous trees for $45. So it's very cheap, it's an excellent price. And you order your tree online. The website is really well organized. It'll let you choose whether you want a tree that grows big or small, one that grows in the shade or in the sun. It gives you all the details about the different species. So I really encourage you to check that out. And once your tree is ready, you pick it up and you can plant it yourself. It's quite small, so it's not too difficult. So there was a spring campaign that was very popular this year. And the fall campaign is starting August 26th. So on August 26th, if you log onto the website, they'll have all the new species of trees that it will be available to plant during the fall. And a lot of people question whether it's a good time to plant trees. It's actually, the fall is the best time to plant trees because if you plant it during the summer, it will invest most of its energy into the leaves. But if you plant a tree during the fall, the tree will really invest energy into making roots, and that'll help it survive till the next summer. One thing that's good to know, especially if you're not the owner of your property, it can help you convince the owner to let you get a tree, is that trees tend to increase the value of your property. So think of it as an investment. Now, what else can you do to increase biodiversity? So there's all sorts of things you can do just in your own backyard. Ditch the lawn. So this might scare a few people. We're not telling people to get rid of lawn entirely. We're just asking them to rethink the necessity of lawn. So lawn was actually, it's a trend that started in aristocratic England, and it's well adapted to certain areas of England, but its popularity has spread all across the world in many areas where lawn just ecologically doesn't make sense because it requires so much water, species that just don't grow in certain areas, and tons of pesticides and money to take care of these lawns. So there's different solutions to maybe change the way we think about lawn and try and make it a bit more eco-friendly. Here's an easy one. Just let things be a little. So forget about the pesticides. Most pesticides are actually illegal on private properties in Montreal, except for some very low impact pesticides. And as well, you can get a permit if you have an infestation problem, but that's very complex. You have to warn the neighbors, you have to make sure you're not near waterways. So it's really better to find other solutions to pest problems. So a simple thing you can do is also to mow your lawn less. Let it grow a little bit taller before you mow it, and don't mow it as short. You can also leave entire areas of your backyard untouched. So just let them grow wild, and it will be a home to many species. It's what we call a buffer zone. So that allows species to recuperate in between mowings, and so you won't kill everything in your backyard from mowing the lawn. You can also leave grass shavings on your lawn after you mow them, instead of collecting them and putting the garbage or the compost. And so this actually improves the health of your lawn because it leaves important nutrients. So those nutrients will leach onto your lawn that's still alive. And it also helps keeps the water on your lawn. We also encourage you to be more tolerant towards weeds. So this concept of a uniform green lawn needs to be rethought. So for example, I have a picture of milkweed in the left corner. So milkweed has become really popular because now we know that it's essential to the life cycle of monarchs. And now that people are actually leaving milkweed alone, monarchs are actually making a comeback. So this is true for milkweed, but it's also true that many other weeds that we try and eliminate have a lot of benefits for biodiversity in the city. So, for example, dandelions bring a lot of, because of their deep roots, they bring a lot of nutrients to the top of the soil for other plants. They're also great for pollinators. There's many weeds that are actually edible. If you're interested in that, I encourage you to look it up, but many of the weeds in your backyard you could actually make into a salad. But of course, be careful with that. Make sure you know what you're doing. You don't want to start poisoning yourself. Another thing you can do or not do is to skip the raking this fall. So a coat of leaves will actually help protect your lawn from the snow during the winter. So your lawn actually won't die during the winter. It'll be easier for it to come back in the summer with a protective layer of trees. The leaves are also an important habitat for many microorganisms and insects. So here are some other alternatives to grass. You can always plant ground covers. So these include creeping herbs such as thyme and oregano. I have a picture of thyme on the bottom in the middle, so that purple flower there. And there's also species such as Japanese sweetgrass, creeping jenny, and there's a whole bunch of species to choose from depending on where you live and what you're looking for. You can also simply plant clover. So clover is a great plant to improve the health of your soil because it's a nitrogen fixer, which is an important nutrient for all plants. So it only requires watering when it's freshly planted. After that, it's very low maintenance. You can also choose ornamental grasses. So these are great for no-mow lawns because you can let them grow out and they look very elegant just as they are. However, they're not great if you plan to step on your lawn a lot and use it. It's more of a decorative plant. It's great for dry, sunny areas. If you really want your ornamental grass to survive, we encourage you to look for native species. There's usually an abundance of choices. Great for shady areas is moss cover. So that is very low maintenance. It's very comfortable to step on. You can also plant native perennial beds. So for that, we have our NDG perennial plant exchange. So again, you can plant any type of perennials. So perennials are plants that come back year after year, so you only need to plant them once, and they will usually survive throughout the winter and come back the next year. Of course, we encourage you to plant native ones just to encourage native species. But there's a lot of European species and Asian species that also survive quite well in our climate. So the perennial plant exchange will be happening Saturday, September 19th in Summerled Park. So it's organized by the Éco-Quartier and it's entirely free. So if you're interested, please contact us at ecoquartier@gmail.com or call us at 514-486-2727. And even if you don't need new plants, we encourage you to bring in all the plants that you don't need anyway, because extras will be donated to beautify the space in front of low-cost housing units. So your plants will go to a good cause. I also want to bring up the relationship between cats and urban birds. So cats are non-native predators. Birds really aren't adapted to dealing with this threat. And so they're one of the leading causes of bird deaths in cities all across the world. So one thing you can do to keep your cat from killing birds is to install a bell on its collars. However, we would encourage you to go even further and try and wean your cat off outdoor time entirely. And this is a bit controversial. A lot of people feel like it's inhumane to keep your cat indoors, but actually many cat welfare organizations encourage you to keep your cat indoors, regardless of the well-being of birds, because indoor cats tend to be much healthier because they don't get into fights, they don't get as many diseases. So it's not just about bird well-being, it's about the well-being of your cat. And so in this case, of course, you want to provide a stimulating indoor environment for your cat. So with toys, with space for it to climb. You can also try harness training your cat. You can also set up a patio. So that's an enclosure in your backyard that allows you your cat to spend time outdoors, but protected. So he gets the benefits of outdoors, but he can't run off. You can also try cat-proofing your entire yard. So there are fences that are sold specifically for this purpose. And so this allows your cat to roam your yard but it keeps your cat in, and it keeps other cats that could get into fights with your own out of the yard. As far as weaning your cat off outdoor time goes, it's a great time to do that near the winter, because cats like to spend more time indoors during the winter anyway. So that's a good information to know. And once again, we're not asking you to do something that's harmful for your cats for the birds. It's really something that's beneficial to cats and birds at the same time. So finally, there's even simpler things you can do. Just try and provide a diversity of habitats for species in your backyard. So even just putting down a large rock, that will create a different microhabitat than your lawn. Replacing fences with a hedge. Hedges are wildlife corridors, so there's all sorts of species that transit through hedges from one backyard to the next. So there's insects and all sorts of organisms, but also mammals. Even dead wood. Many different insects use dead wood during part of their life cycle. So I have a picture of a pretty log planter, but it doesn't have to be that fancy. You can really just stick a log in your backyard, and that literally will increase the biodiversity in your backyard. Here's another idea for those of you that like crafting. You can build an insect hotel. So there are so many different versions of insect hotels with so many different materials. A lot of them encourage native pollinators. So Chantal talked a little bit about honeybees, but their honeybees are actually a non-native species. So they're from Europe and Asia. But we have a lot of native bee species that don't necessarily live in colonies, and bee hotels are often great for them, as well as other insects, other pollinators, but also predators and parasites, all sorts of insects that are part of the food chain and that can help play different roles in your backyard. So I won't go into detail of all the different versions, but there's plenty of guides for building them on the internet, or you can just buy one as well. And here are some resources. Chantal, do you want to talk about these?
Yeah, sure. So I had mentioned Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Like I said before, it was a book I read in my last semester in the seminar class of my undergraduate degree. I thought it was a very insightful book. Much of the traditional ecological knowledge that I presented in this webinar comes directly from this book. I think it's a great read, very insightful, and really brings you on a interesting journey, to say the least. So I highly recommend it. And then second, we have the website for Éco-Quartier, just to check some trees if you're willing to purchase one for your yard.
So thank you for listening to us. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now.
Hi, I have a question. You talked about the ash borer and the emerald ash borer and the damage it did. And I had one of my trees cut down. By the way, I feel I'm probably part of the choir and you're talking to the converted. I've studied permaculture and I've been involved in a lot of different things that relate to a lot of what you said. But I have a birch tree that grew close by the emerald ash, the ash tree that had to be cut down. And now it has died. Do you know if this would be infected by the ash tree?
So the emerald ash borer at least
you said
in this area, it only affects the ash tree. Luckily,
I thought
because it's very specific.
Okay, I thought but I thought I misunderstood you that it does affect others.
No, luckily, I imagine it affects a different tree in Asia. Um, but I don't know exactly why it targets specifically the ash tree. But really the reason it was allowed to spread is that there's just so many ash trees in Montreal. They were planted everywhere. There's
Yeah.
entire streets of them.
And not only that, I think some of them grow naturally, you know, like you talked about squirrels spreading oak. I think a lot of them, you know, maybe birds spread seeds, whatever. So a lot of them, you know, in yards might grow quite naturally. Uh, I just wonder why there's disease near where the ash borer tree was, or the infected tree was. Are you familiar with what might cause this?
I mean, it wouldn't be the insect itself. I don't know enough to know if like a tree that's affected by one stress factor can affect a different tree. But it's possible. Like I don't know enough to tell you, but it's quite interesting actually that your other tree fell down.
It's fallen down, but it is dead, quite obviously.
Yeah.
Don't
Okay.
you have any pictures I could send the city out of curiosity to see if it's a pattern they've observed before?
I'll take one tomorrow.
That'd be great.
Yeah, yeah. I'll try to get it. It's kind of a shady area. I'll try to get a good picture of it, maybe in the right light.
Because I've never heard of anything either, but imagine that, you know, there's something we haven't thought of, like as the ash tree is dying, it contaminates the soil, or I'm really not sure what could happen, but you know, having learned about tree mothers transferring their nutrients to babies, I now realize that there's so much I don't know that maybe we could ask one of the horticultural experts in the city.
I have another tree close by. I'm not sure what it is. I call it a snowball tree because in the spring it's just magnificently covered with these white snowball flowers. But it too seems to be having a serious problem. And I had some of it cut out. And I've keep watering. I'm watering my trees when it's really hot now, and I think it's making a big difference.
Yeah, about those, the tree though, with your birch tree, I may have read it somewhere that within their root systems, that trees that are growing right close to each other are very much interconnected, and they kind of share the nutrients in a way. So it could be that because your ash tree was lost, that your birch tree didn't have a sufficient amount of nutrients being provided. I feel like I saw that in one of my classes, but I am not 100% sure, but I feel like that is a possibility.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I had a few comments. I was so excited by what you were bringing up because I had a little list, and it's like you guys just kept bringing them up. And then the last one I had on my list was keep the cat in the house, and I'm like, she's never going to mention that. She's never going to. Oh, she mentioned it. Which I thought was really fun. I found out this year that Côte-des-Neiges has Monarch Watch status as a borough.
Okay.
And there's a website from Espace de la Vie in partnership with, I believe, World Wildlife Fund and a few other organizations. So they invite anybody who spots milkweed to go onto their database and plug in, I guess, the GPS location. It's much easier than I'm making it sound. And that way they can track all the spottings of milkweed. And like you guys were talking about, hopefully see an increase in the actual presence of the monarchs after we can document all this milkweed. And it's fun because whereas it used to be seen as this ugly little plant that nobody knew what it did, now suddenly we're seeing people write to the David Suzuki Foundation asking for plants. We had so many extra milkweed plants in our pollinator garden that we actually gave them to a school, and we're going to follow up with them to see how well they were transplanted, because some weeds don't enjoy being transplanted or moved or getting any kind of extra attention. But I think it's really exciting that we're really watching the monarch as one of the emblematic species. And what we always think about is the fact that there's umbrella species. Like when I studied my wildlife, we would talk about the charismatic megafauna. So the World Wildlife Fund chose the panda, but we all know that in saving the panda, you save so many other species that depend on the panda and all the interconnectivity. So having the monarch as one of our symbols is such a beauty to maybe represent some of the other little insects that are maybe not as photogenic or as stylish.
Mm-hmm.
Nikki, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you have any more milkweed plants, and when is the right time? I've tried several times to grow milkweed, and I've done it with a whole plant, I've done it with seeds, and somehow I haven't been successful. Does your pollinating garden have any more?
We definitely have more. I will follow up again with the school to see if we can get an answer, but if you're willing, we could transplant either way. Even if they didn't have success, maybe you would have a success, but I know we definitely have some to give.
That would be wonderful. And is there a best time to plant?
That would be a good research question. I think I'll ask a volunteer to check. Best time to plant, exactly.
I did the transplanting of the whole plant, I think in early June.
Okay.
And I planted seeds when not that long ago, and I don't see any results.
I was not successful for the seeds, and when I looked, it talked about a 2-year cycle, and my seeds didn't make it past the first year, so I really didn't see how anything was going to happen in the second year. But you know, when the plant establishes itself in nature, I'm hoping it's a little bit stronger to move.
Yeah, and maybe not when it's hot, maybe when it's a little.
Maybe, yeah. A friend of mine has a kind of a fence that's set up so that a very small portion of his land is on the outside part of his fence, and his very well-meaning neighbors cleaned up his area this spring, and they cut down all the milkweed, not understanding what it was for. And I really had to control myself to not go and talk to them and say, look, you know, you shouldn't do this. But I'm so excited because they clear cut it in the beginning of May, and it is absolutely back. It has pods. It is doing great.
Pods.
So it's really resilient. So I'm really excited about that part.
Yeah. I remember as a kid playing with the pods. They were so much fun. They're silky. I don't know if any of you have ever played with them.
My grandmother used to make angels. She would take a pine cone and glue the outside parts, the outer parts of the milkweed plant, and then she would put a chestnut head.
Oh, beautiful. That's where you get all your creative ideas.
Crafty grandmother, yes.
Lovely.
And another thing about the biodiversity, I remember going on a biodiversity walk in the Falaise Saint-Jacques, and somebody had told me that there were deer there. And I'm very sorry, but I was in complete disbelief, and I saw tracks, and I thought maybe it was a big dog. I really wasn't sure. And so the group kept going, but I had to go back to the office, and when I turned, I saw a deer at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the Falaise Saint-Jacques, which would have been, if I had kept walking up, it would have been basically at the corner of Cavendish and Saint-Jacques. So it's hard to believe, but the wildlife that we have, we don't always see it. I've seen fox, I've seen deer, I've seen mink in Angrignon Park, muskrats. I mean, there's so much that we have that we never actually get to see, but it's here, and somehow it survives with us. That's really exciting too.
That's amazing about the deer, because that space isn't that big. I've walked it, and well, I haven't walked the whole thing, but I've done a nature walk there. So it's quite incredible, and that's wonderful.
I was really surprised. Something I found out recently was about the insect hotels, is that you actually need to clean them out every year. Apparently, if you don't, you can really affect, you can really leave bacteria behind for different bees or other species that are going to be using them. So I had always assumed that it was made out of natural material, it was left out in nature, and all of that was okay. But I read some really challenging articles about how you could be the spreader of disease instead of being the spreader of increased biodiversity. And that really, really affected me and made me feel like I would have to be very careful about putting out an older insect hotel.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, someone had told me that when I first learned about insect hotels, and then I didn't see it anywhere else, and everyone was so excited about insect hotels. I'm like, it must not be that important. But you know, it might just not be information that we're spreading because everyone's so excited to make this insect hotel. But I know you can buy ones where you can actually change the little tubes and things like that. But I don't know about these homemade ones.
My understanding was even the homemade ones, you could like delicately do it with a cotton swab and a little bit of alcohol, or, you know, the other question is what kind of products do you want to use on very fragile little creatures like that? I wouldn't pull out the big bleach, or I don't know. I guess I'd have to question about what kind of products and how long they had time for those chemicals to wear off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was looking at insect hotels and I wanted to make a section on that. I'm like, oh my God, there's so much information. There's so many different ways. So I'm like, I'm just going to put it out there and show people what it is.
There really are. And there's some fun ones. I've been walking through different parts of Montreal and you find one randomly on the street in Verdun. And, you know, it's just there as an educational tool. And it's just really fun how people have gotten into them.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a very interesting talk at the Maison de Développement Durable, and they were mentioning what you were talking about in terms of accepting the weeds. And they were mentioning the really, really important but barely visible insects that really rely on what we consider weeds, little green bits that aren't technically grass, aren't technically a flower, but are just so important to such a huge variety of creatures that I think our lust for the perfect lawn goes so against that. It's I think if we thought more about our little creatures, we'd be more on their side.
Yeah.
That's the thing with Leah and I going out on patrol often. We see everyone's like front yards, and like being from the West Island is just so different to see all of this. But like, oh my God, some people have very elaborate like front like yards, even though it's very small. It's actually so diverse, and there's not a single like speck of grass. It's like, it's crazy. Like just like the variety that we see. Sometimes we walk by, we're like, that's so pretty. Yeah, but like it's just like I just discovered like so much more. Like, okay, yeah, a lawn, but like this is so much better.
And you don't have to mow it too. That's the thing.
It's like water and stuff within hours. So.
And they have such diverse colors that you can imagine that it attracts different pollinators in different cycles and different needs, and is just so dynamic.
Mm.
And meanwhile, what is grass doing?
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of like a changing your mindset, like we're kind of conditioned to think everyone has to have grass, and it's a status symbol if you have really perfect green uniform grass. And there's nothing like natural about like a completely uniform cover of plant, you know. That's just not the way nature works.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It's like what I talked about with like the whole idea of polyculture and how different plants can benefit each other and stuff. It's just having that in, whether it be like a small space or like your whole front yard, it's just like it provides just so much more for the environment than just having a blank slate of grass.
How do you get the message out to those who have those perfect lawns? I live in a neighborhood. We have one person who's never mows his lawn, and it's totally weeds. And you know, I have a pollinating garden on the front, but I still have some lawn. I don't know if you can call it grass. I don't plant. I plant some clover when I can, and I know it requires water, as you mentioned, but I'd like to do more transition of things. But I'm wondering about the area that the city owns. I think it's 3 feet. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about those rules?
You know, the city owns it, but they don't specify whether you have to have grass. You could have perennials the whole up to it, which is what I did at my boyfriend's place. The challenge is that because they own it, if they have any work to do, they rip everything out, and they really don't care what they rip out when they have work to do. But you know, they don't insist on any kind of specific plants being in that space that they own.
Yeah, my area is on an incline and it's quite sunny. I wanted to plant hostas, but I don't know if do you know much about hostas? And
Hostas, they will tolerate some sun, but they do like it pretty shady. Usually I always get stuck in the opposite situation where I'm in a shady garden and I choose hostas because they're one of the few, but I know that they can get exhausted if it's overly, sun beating down on them kind of thing, but they'll do pretty well for a lot of sun still.
Okay, thanks.
And of course, there's always, easy things like lilies and things like that that just eat the sun up. So there's always so many choices. Come to our perennial plant exchange.
Right.
Yeah, I have some plants that are outgrowing in my front yard a little bit. I'm like, I need to bring them.
That's what happens. Our perennials grow into each other and they start choking each other, and then they're not as pretty either. So it's such a benefit with the perennials because they can start a new beautification somewhere else. And of course, all those things will increase the biodiversity in your garden. So the more different colors of flowers, the different flowering times that you have, and all this really, really increases what you can do in terms of the power of the biodiversity.
Yeah, that's the thing. I find like a lot of people, what they do when they're planting their gardens, they don't kind of look into what the plants really are and like what kind of conditions they prefer and stuff. And that's when their plants aren't really successful in a way. So it's good to like make sure to like look up, okay, does this plant A, does it go with plant B, yes or no kind of thing. And sometimes like, yeah, a plant might be unsuccessful in your garden, but it might be very much successful in someone else's. So that's why I love the idea of the perennial plant exchange.
And the leftovers always go to a good cause, which is fun too. Well, I think we will wrap it up here unless anybody has another question or another comment. I'd like to thank Lea and Chantal for presenting this, and I'd like to thank the rest of you for attending with us. It's been a very interesting discussion. I found it really stimulating, and it's got me thinking about what other projects we can work on at the Éco-Quartier and what else we can do to get some things happening. But please, of course, send us your comments and we'll put it on Facebook, our video, and please encourage your friends who weren't able to join us tonight to look at it online.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.